All right, very good. We're getting started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all are. Welcome to our second public event with Action Track 4. We're very excited to have you all here today. So we know that this is being cast live on Facebook. So if you're watching us from Facebook, welcome. Please leave your chats. We'll be able to engage with you in that way. If you are on a Zoom, also, please feel free to drop your chats there. And we're very excited to be with you all here today. So on behalf of the UN Food System Summit Action Track 4, which is the action track that I'm on, I wanted to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Radeta Bebe. I'm a member of this leadership team of Action Track 4. I'm also an assistant professor of computer science at the University of California, Berkeley, where I work on research that focuses on using algorithmic and computational techniques to understand and tackle questions related to equity and justice concerns, which makes me feel very proud of the work that we're doing through this leadership group and beyond. So we hope that today's event is going to spark good dialogue about challenges and opportunities that we've been examining. Since Action Track 4 is about advancing equitable livelihoods, what we'll focus on today, and as we have in our working group, is to focus on people, to focus on individuals and communities, and also their livelihoods at various points in the food system. So this can range from small-scale farmers to the retailers to really anyone that you might encounter on this food chain and on this food system, and we want to think critically about how we can advance equity across this whole system in a way that is structural and systematic, and sort of creates resilient systems that can help advance livelihoods. So together we need to realize structural and systemic transformation in our food system so that all people can earn a fair wage for their work and a just price for their products, and including, for instance, women and young women and girls and women that we know are so critical to the food system. So this is our second public consultation, and you might ask, why are we holding these consultations, and why are we holding a second one in particular? Well, for the UN Food System Summit, for it to yield concrete and positive results in the lives of marginalized and underserved communities, we need to hear from the public. We need to hear from you all, and we need to hear about your thoughts about what is working, about what we've been doing so far, and what should be improved. So we're going to present to you some solutions that we've thought about over the past several months since we last heard from you, and we want to know what we've gotten right and what we can continue to push on so we can ensure that the final set of solutions and proposals that we're bringing forth are as positive and as useful for marginalized communities as they can be. So your active participation is really crucial, is critical to what we're doing, to ensuring that we have an integrated and rights-based approaches to governance and policymaking at all levels in order to address the structural inequities and power imbalances that may plague our food systems. So online consultations like this one have their limitations, but this action track has been working tirelessly to build processes on democratic principles and transparent deliberation, shared power, and inclusive participation to ensure that policies are not driven only by evidence, but also by ethics and by broad public interest and public buy-in. So let's get started today. What we'll do is we're first honored to have Michelle Nunn, CARE CEO and President, join us today, and I believe she'll be here actually for the duration of the event, which is really exciting. So we're going to hear from Michelle Nunn, and we'll get updated on the process by Martin Frick, whom you've heard from at the last consultation as well. Martin Frick is a UN Food System Secretariat. And he'll tell us why it's important to engage and give us an update on the process. Then we'll hear from several people. I'll be able to introduce them as they're speaking. And as you're hearing from members of this action track, I encourage you to think critically about what we got right, what's missing, and what's the best way to engage with you as we move forward. So please keep these 3 questions in mind, because we're going to be taking in your feedback and improving on our solutions as we keep going. And we're not going to be solving all the problems today, but we're hoping to get your honest and candid conversation and feedback. And so we strongly encourage you to use the chat either to talk amongst one another, or to ask us questions, or to leave your thoughts of any kind, really, that you think relates to something that's been discussed. And we'll be using that to respond live. And if not, then we'll be able to respond in an asynchronous fashion. So we really encourage you to use the chats freely. We found that it works really well in the past, and we hope to continue to use it again. We have a really packed schedule. So for all our speakers here, I apologize in advance, but I'm going to be interrupting you if you're running over. We got to keep it moving. So we're going to be moving at a very brisk pace here. So with that in mind, with those virtual housekeeping items in mind, we'll get started with our action track for leader, president of CARE, and CEO, Michelle Nunn, who is going to be starting us off and closing us off today. So we get to hear from Michelle twice. I'll give it to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rudy. Thank you. You are a wonderful both member of this team and also moderator. So we're really lucky to have you spending this time with us today and helping us navigate the opportunity to bring so many voices into the conversation. And so I, as the chair of the Action Track 4 and also as the CEO of CARE, I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to be a part of this work. We have a truly stellar and extraordinary team that ranges across geography and across age and across expertise. And I'm so delighted at the level of commitment. And this is, again, keeping in mind volunteer commitment from all the participants that you'll hear from who are a part of this Action Track 4. And then we're really so proud that we have the opportunity to engage so many broader voices. I think we really do see this as the People's Summit, so to speak, in which we all gather around a table and talk about this most important and elemental dimension of our existence, which is around food and how diverse, sustainable, equitable food systems can be realized through our joint aspiration and action. And so from member states and governments, the private sector, to INGOs, to fisher folk and women and labor and Indigenous and tribal rights groups and so many others, the idea is to bring us together. I think that we anticipate that we'll have hundreds and perhaps 1,000 participants that are coming together through this gathering. So we're very grateful. And what we want to do through this is to give you a framework, but really to share with you the solutions that have been sourced from the broader community. Let's say the community, the public community, and also our community of experts. And we want to see which ones you think can work, and we want to also hear your additional ideas. And I do think, we keep talking in sometimes some big narrative terms around structural imbalances and systemic solutions. But I think ultimately what we want to do is ensure that we have meaningful, real changes that we can both describe and act upon. And that's the opportunity for us to collect today. And so personally, one of the things that, for instance, CARE centers our work on is around gender. And we know that there is no more kind of insidious power imbalance than in gender as it relates to our food systems. And that, in fact, we can't realize our visions without ensuring that half of the population is engaged. We also need to find new ways of engaging young people and Indigenous people. So we have to correct these imbalances, and we need some very specific ideas to do that and to take action. And so it's why this gathering over the next few hours is so important. And it's why we are so invested in ensuring that we take this moment. And I don't think we have to describe to you all why this moment is so important, but the long-term issues that we're addressing, in addition to those issues that have been laid bare by the pandemic and have been exacerbated, call for us to do things differently. And as Mehdi said, everyone should have an opportunity in the food system to have a living wage, a just wage for their labors, and the opportunity to have nurturing and sustainable and nutritious food. So I want to thank everyone who's going to present today. I think you'll be impressed by both their level of passion and expertise. And I hope that you all, if you haven't already done so, that you'll participate in the community platform action track discussion, that you'll be an ongoing participant and constituent of this work. And most importantly, I think we're very eager to, to hear from you in this session and in an ongoing way. So I hope, as Mehdi said, you will take part in the chat throughout, and that you'll also have an opportunity to offer up your own ideas and suggestions for us. So it's my pleasure now to hand it off to Martin Frick, who is really one of the sort of orchestrators and masterminds of the larger Food System Summit process. And he's going to walk you through a little bit of how this is working and what our ambitions are. So, Martin, I'll hand it to you.
Michelle, thank you very much. And before I start, a big shout out to you, to Christine, to the entire team at CARE, everybody working as a volunteer, doing a fantastic job, particularly in listening. And this is more than anything else, a listening exercise. So thank you for that. As we are entering this year, we are with COVID, and COVID will be with us. And we look forward towards the 2030 agenda. And if we look at that, there are two big issues that we need to bring together. One is the environmental agenda. Much progress has been done on climate change. Some fantastic announcements started this year of more needs to be done on biodiversity. But we are also in a hunger crisis. The number of hungry people is going up. The latest FAO study gives us a number of a staggering 3 billion people who are food insecure. Very clearly, we cannot solve either or if we are looking at these issues in an isolated manner, because we will never be able to fight climate change and biodiversity loss if we ignore people's need. And on the other side, we will never be able to build sustainable livelihoods for people if this planet is going down the drain. So Action Track 4, the point on livelihoods, is just sitting so squarely in the middle of the 2030 agenda. The most important word here, I think, and that is coming out very strongly in Action Track 4 so far, but is also the basis of the high-level panel of experts, the think tank, if you so wish, from the Committee on World Food Security latest paper, which we are going to discuss on Monday in the CFS, handing so strongly, is the point on agency. We need to empower people to walk the talk, to really work on their own food systems, to be empowered to find solutions. And I'm very happy that I'm seeing that in Action Track 4 really coming up. We need that, as it's been showed in the COVID crisis, because as Dr. Tedros from the World Health Organization said, good nutrition is the first front line in fighting COVID. But we are also seeing in return, and that relates to the livelihood points, that with the experience of COVID for now a year, we see that particularly those working in food systems are particularly vulnerable because they are underpaid, because they are often not enjoying their basic and fundamental human rights, because they are sitting crammed together in housing, because they are migrant worker. And we need to really address that. And that brings me to my last point, and that's very much a process point. And process has a tendency to be boring, but this one is not, because the future for me of the United Nations is really an inclusive multilateralism, not just having excellencies talking to excellencies, but making that a people summit, bringing everybody in, listening to what people have to say, share the energy, share the inspiration, share the tools, and most importantly, again, listen to people. So I wanted to encourage you for three things, four actually. One, become a food systems hero. You can do that simply by registering on our website. The second point is push your governments to participate in national level dialogues. They are coming your way as well. As of now, we have a bit more than 70 countries in the pipeline for national level dialogues. There's the possibility also to host independent dialogues. And that is for any one of you who feels like, I like this spirit of openness and cooperation and multi-stakeholder collaboration. You can do that in your university, in your city, whatever your community might be. And let me conclude with the last bit. We are online with our communications platform. That is foodsystems.community, foodsystems.community. Register there, make your voice heard, and use the time that we have until the pre-summit and the summit to really be part of the discussion and hopefully also carry the action forwards after the summit. Let me stop here and very eager to hear from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's always great to hear from you. And we are on time. This makes me feel good. All right. So up next is, I believe we have Shakuntula Tilstead. Do we have Shakuntula? I know this was...
Yeah, she hasn't been able to join yet, so if we could just move to the next speaker.
We can just move to the next. Okay, great. We're going to move to Carl Deering. Carl, are you joined by Juan? I don't know how to... Okay, very good. Maybe you can pronounce their last name. I apologize. I don't know. But yes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rediat. And I will just wait for a second for slides to come up. My name is Carl. I'm supporting Michelle and the Action Track 4 Leadership Group. I'm going to talk just for about 6 or 8 minutes, hopefully, about the categories of game-changing solutions that we have been working on and that have come through to Action Track 4. But before I go through these briefly, I just want to start by building a little bit on what Michelle and Martin both said in terms of who we're talking about here. The focus of this short presentation is what is being proposed as game-changing solutions, but I want to reiterate who we're talking about. And of course, if we are talking about equitable access to livelihoods in food systems, that means that we're talking invariably about people, communities, groups who are experiencing the negative impacts of inequity in food systems. So if the examples that we're talking about appear to be focusing on farmers, for example, it's not just small-scale farmers that we're addressing or that the solutions are addressing. We're also talking about fishers, pastoralists, forest-dependent communities, but we're also talking about workers in food systems and in food value chains. So workers that would be experiencing the impacts of inequality and inequity, seasonal labor, casual labor, migrant labor, anybody in processing, packaging and distribution chains that might be exposed to inequities, also workers in informal markets, urban markets, peri-urban food markets, or anybody in fragile or exposed labor markets in food systems. We're also talking about people, managers, entrepreneurs, and workers in small and medium enterprise who often also face the inequities of food systems and the way they are governed. Intersectionality. A lot of these people experience vulnerability for more than one reason. They may be a young woman in an urban food market, or there may be a young man who is a migrant in a an urban food market. So they're facing compound vulnerability, and that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about these solutions. We have categorized this as best we can. There are still solutions coming in, more than 70. So they're difficult to catalog and categorize, but this is what we have for now. And I'm going to go through these categories briefly to explain what kind of solutions are in these categories. And then I'm going to drill down on one of them and ask my colleague Juan to drill down on another. Institutionalizing rights is the first one there, and that's essentially about advancing the adoption or the ratification or the use of statutory rights instruments, global conventions, as well as promoting other instruments such as voluntary guidelines or responsible investment frameworks. It's about looking across the spectrum of rights, the bundle of rights that apply to vulnerable people in food systems, the right to food, obviously, but also women's rights, Indigenous people's rights, labor rights, access to benefit sharing, for example, and any other agreements that advance equity in food systems. The second category is social dialogue and the empowerment of people and people's institutions. This is essentially solutions that are promoting citizen-state dialogue, opening space for voice and multi-stakeholder platforms and processes that improve governance and access to processes for vulnerable people in food systems. It's also about promoting collectives and collective action through, for example, cooperatives, producer associations or small business associations, labor unions, that kind of solution. The next category is agency through knowledge and learning. I'm going to drill down in a moment on that one, but I'll go through the others before I do that. The fourth section or category, if you like, is insurance of compliance with laws and regulations. So that's related to the issue of rights, obviously, but it's more about solutions looking at domestic legislation, accountability mechanisms, the application, for example, of labour standards at national level. And one example there, for example, is the International Labour Organization Strategic Compliance Portal, which looks at labour and decent work standards. The next section is policy development, reform and coherence. And that's more than just new policy. We need new policy for new challenges. Michelle mentioned COVID and the challenges that is presenting and the exposure of gross inequities in food systems of the COVID pandemic. It's also about the reform of existing policy or the application of existing policy, such as land tenure, access to other natural resources, and intersectoral coherence. It's about policy coherence across the policy spectrum, such as coherence of food policy or food-related policy with health policy, climate change policy, environment policy, social protection policy, what have you. Advocacy, that's essentially around influencing people and influencing institutions and solutions that drive the possibility to influence investors, donors, governments, private sector, but also local authorities and subnational service providers and duty bearers. It's also a lot of solutions, several coming in about research and the importance of research for influence and the engagement of the science community, and particularly spending more, investing more in research around Indigenous knowledge in food systems. The next is business innovation and technology. This is looking at solutions like bridging the digital divide, for example, in access to information technology for people who are vulnerable in food systems, improved information for decision making, and the use of intermediate technology that is context specific. It's also about finance, innovative finance for medium, micro, medium, and small enterprise, and other innovations and solutions such as agroecology. I'll come back to that in a moment. But Indigenous knowledge again came up in this category. Equitable investment is the next category. I'll leave that to my colleague Juan in a moment and just jump straight to data management. Lots of solutions coming in about information, data capture, data management, data protection, data processing, and how we need to have data for equity, data that reflects inequity, so that decisions can be based on that data, capturing better and more social indicator, for example, capturing non-monetary benefits, cultural benefits, as well as, of course, fundamentals like the capture of sex and age disaggregated data. Youth. Child-focused interventions, we could include youth in that one as well, because there's solutions coming in around investing in youth, and child-focused interventions such as school-based agriculture information, climate information, environment, nutrition, education in school systems, but there are also solutions around school feeding, vocational and educational training around agriculture and agriculture-related business. I'll just jump then finally, or it's almost finally, to livelihood support. That's a big bucket of solutions there. Lots of solutions around innovative extension, more on innovative finance, but also the kind of intervention or model that drives both environmental integrity, nutrition and health outcomes, and sustainable agriculture, such as silvopastoralism, agroforestry, other forms of agroecological investments that are also defined in some terms as nature-based solutions that consider landscapes and territorial approaches to food system integrity and to environmental integrity. And finally, social protection. This is everything to do with minimum floors and statutory obligations around pensions, maternity benefit, child benefit, disability benefit, that would help vulnerable people in food systems, but also the use of cash and vouchers and other innovative safety net approaches, particularly in food crisis, in fragile and conflict-affected environments where there are a lot of compound vulnerabilities, and the use of cash or vouchers can mitigate that. Insurance is another one that's come in as some of those solutions. The next slide, please, and I'll just drill a little bit briefly into the next point, which was to go back to strengthening agency through knowledge and learning. So if you can move on to the next slide, probably there, Caroline, if you can hear that. Yeah, and the next one, please. Yeah, so just very briefly on agency, and I was glad that Martin mentioned this. Action Track 4 has had a lot of suggestions around building the agency of people, and in fact, our leadership group is very much convinced that the agency of people in food systems is our game changer. Game changers are people, and that's about confidence, self-esteem, knowledge, skills and capabilities. And the example that I have here is that gender relations involves the exercise of agency, which tells us that we need to focus on better analysis and response to contextual factors that mediate gender relations. The high-level panel report in 2019 articulates a commitment to agency. Actually, this was the report on agroecology and other innovative solutions, and it highlights the importance of strengthening agency and recommends member states to strengthen agency and stakeholder engagement, empower vulnerable and marginalized groups, and address power inequalities in food systems. So this is locked into a HLP panel report, and something that we're seeing a lot of progress on, and we want to build on that. So a lot of the proposals and game changers are aiming at strengthening agency, and some of those are around knowledge and learning for agency. And then that's the next slide, please, Caroline, if I may, and I'll give some examples of game changers here. The first one is around social learning models, participatory models, such as farmer field schools or fisher schools, pastoralist schools, that build on indigenous knowledge and enable improved extension and peer-to-peer learning. The next one is around social audit and social accountability tools, using community scorecards, for example, as citizen-driven accountability tools, which improves planning, monitoring, and the evaluation of public services and the standard and quality of public services. The next one is applied research and learning, but that is with, by, and for Indigenous peoples, women, migrant and seasonal workers, and people in small and medium enterprise. So it's not just global North research. It's changing the way we do research, how we do it, what we do it for, and who we do it with. Community development collectives. That's a little bit. Coming through different categories, but it's about supporting councils, clubs, savings groups, producer groups to increase access to information and governance processes. And finally, connecting Indigenous change makers, youths, women, and holders of traditional and contemporary knowledge through learning and capacity strengthening networks. So the solution being investing and supporting in networking so that these groups can have access not only to more information, but to more human solidarity and community solidarity. And just over the weekend, an additional point came through on that, suggesting inventorizing Indigenous knowledge, for example, so that Indigenous knowledge is protected and promoted. I'll stop there. Sorry if that was a little bit long read yet, but I'll pass to my colleague Juan, who is going to go into a little bit more detail on one of the other categories. Juan, over to you, and the next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Carl, and please, next slide. So yeah, my name is Juan Echanove, and I'm the Senior Director for Food and Water Systems and Care. And as you have seen, there are many solutions, actually 70 so far, as part of this consultation process, right, that we have been, that are actually emerging, right? And I should also highlight the idea that this consultation process is taking place in the context of, our conversations with an ample range of organizations, including not only local organizations, also fish stocks organizations, farmers, pastoralists, etc., who are part of our strategic group in the action track, or represented via the different members of the group. So what I'm going to do now is a bit of a deeper dive on the equitable investment set of solutions, just to kind of make it a bit more tangible what we are referring to by these solutions in this particular case. So if we move to the next slide, right? I mean, of course, the idea of equitable investment is that to promote rural development and inclusion, countries must take a specific policy and programmatic actions on investments, right, that could reach the poor directly. And this should include a combination of social and economic policies, and you will see some examples of both here. So here are some of the ideas, again, just some examples that we have received. And these ideas are very preliminary at this stage. I'm going to skip the first one, the Global Matching Grant Fund for Capital Investment, because I'm going to go a bit deeper into that, just to again illustrate what the conversations taking place around specific ideas. So fair market, fair price, and fair wages. And that basically refers to the notion, the target could be something like by 2025 or 2030, we'll have to define a specific year to support living incomes and decent jobs. Farmers could receive an increase of X% of the share of the added value produced at national level. And that would be based on negotiation, whether at local level or national level or international level. And there are indeed some examples of that already happening, right? And I guess one of those is the increase in the floor price and also the fixed premium that cocoa farmers are getting in West Africa. You may know that in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana, both countries announced last year that they could set a minimum price for cocoa in a bid to basically finally give cocoa farmers a living income. So that kind of model could be applied to other value chains in other sectors, whether nationally, locally, etc. Local procurement. The idea is that governments could open public procurement to small-scale farmers, and that basically means a more flexible approach towards taxation. So small-scale farmers can be within the rules of procurement to public bodies, whether those are schools, so farmers can contribute to school feeding programs, or hospitals, or canteens in the army, etc. And there is a good number of countries that have been already ruling that, including Brazil or Guatemala, Dominican Republic, also some countries in Africa. Increased investments, right? I mean, commitments towards an increased investment for rural socioeconomic infrastructures, or to increase support to youth and women in rural areas. And there has been this kind of commitments to X percentage of the public investment. For instance, in the case of the Malabo and Maputo Declaration a few years ago, the commitment by sub-Saharan African countries that at least 10% of their budget should be allocated to agricultural development. Okay, so the idea could be, again, a number of countries to commit that X percentage of the budget to be allocated to rural socioeconomic infrastructure with a specific, with a specific focus on youth and women. If we move to the next slide, please. Next one. So again, and with this, we are going to finalize the presentation. A bit more details on just one of the concrete solutions. And again, we have 70 of those. Global Matching Grant Fund for Capital Investment in the Small and Family Agriculture. The purpose could be that in year X, a global trust fund is established with a total capital to be defined to provide demand-driven co-matching grants for initial capital, meaning for quick investments, whether those are by cooperatives or by other smallholders or business groups, right, who are seeking for investments to growth or expand their production. And this is basically because there is a scarcity, as we all know, for long-term funding, right, for fixed assets or for cash crops. And this is something that has been already proven. IFAD, for instance, has been providing matching grants, and there is a number of evaluations that demonstrate that they really bring a lot of positive results in terms of crowding in private equity and commercial finance for agriculture. And there was also a study by the World Bank demonstrating that 73% of programs that promote co-matching grants have a satisfactory rating by the bank, right? And these matching grants can really improve production technology, incorporating innovative methods of production, etc., right? So it's basically building on these successful experiences and moving forward, making them more scalable. So with this, I will now pass the floor back to Radiet, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the thoughts and comments that you shared, and I also appreciate that we are running early. Even it's the first, so I think this will give us it will give us some more extra time for the next section, which is the discussion session on solutions. And what's really exciting is actually that Christine is telling me there's a lot of questions from Facebook Live that I will either read out if we have it in the chat, or maybe Christine, you can just tell us, and we can maybe start with those. What would be the easiest way to do the questions? Yeah.
Sure, I hope you can see me and hear me. Hi everyone, Christine Campo. I work as Michelle Nunn's direct support as chair of Action Track 4. I just want to thank you for joining us today. This is our second public forum, and this interaction back and forth is really, really helping us strengthen our work. We are only what you give us, so thank you for joining. Two questions that have come so far are on gender and gender empowerment, women's empowerment, gender equality. So maybe we could hear from some of our leadership group members. We have Rima on the call, and the next question is how we are putting agroecology front and center in advancing equitable livelihoods. So maybe Guy could respond to that as well.
Great, thank you so much. And it's been a sheer honor and privilege to be talking about gender equality, women's empowerment. And what I will speak here today is on behalf of the 2 million women workers, all in the informal economy, who are members of SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. And I bring their experiences, their voices in the Action Track 4 as a gender lead in the action track. And I think, as very rightly the questions or the comments that have come in the chat, I think what we have experienced also during the COVID-related lockdown, and also now in the normal situation, is that whenever there are shocks in the lives and livelihoods of the women, I think its direct impact goes on the food intake and also the food consumption. So women have either reduced their food intake, or they have to let go it for the children or for the male members in the family. And therefore, I think the need for food grain support to sustain themselves extends to a much longer need. And this is true also for the migrant workers, especially women workers. And I think the food intake also reduces when money is not available directly in the hands of the women. Therefore, I think there's a strong nexus between livelihoods, food production, and food intake and nutrition. And in spite of such suffering, women are willing to take on new challenges eagerly, without expecting much from the governments or from the businesses, or even whatever little support from the society they could get. Let me share with you how women's empowerment happens when they have access to markets. And I think we saw this, that during the COVID pandemic and the lockdown, the women vegetable vendors started using the electric rickshaws and delivering vegetables and fruits at the doorstep in the cities. And then when we linked those vendors with the small farmers, again, women farmers producing vegetables and fruits, today we have altogether 45,000, not 4 or 5 or 40 or 50, but 45,000 women vegetable growers and vegetable vendors have their own e-enterprise. So they've started using online platforms also. Similarly, I would also say that, with farming, family farming, there's also scope for food processing and food production. So we have a cadre of 15,000 women who now are making dry snacks, bakery and confectionery items, and using small scale commercial equipments. And this becomes their home-based livelihood opportunity also. And when they are linked to an online delivery platform, this becomes a major source of livelihood, which also ensures food security, brings back the traditional grains back into consumption and circulation. And finally, I think I'm going to share how women's empowerment happens when they are organized into an agribusiness company. And we have 25,000 small farmers, all women farmers, who grade, package, and process. And through a cadre of 5,000 sales women, they now have their own brand and have a turnover of close to 2.5 million US dollars. Small, but big for these very small scale entrepreneurs. And in order to manage the demand and supply, now they have their own mobile application. So they do real-time inventory management, and also now they have mobile payment integration systems in place. So I think what the lesson that's coming out is that we need to have women-owned and managed decentralized local supply chains, which can then partner with the larger supply chains. And that's what leads to not just livelihood generation, but also women's involvement and women's participation. And that's how I think women can manage the food systems and their empowerment happens. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Remat. Wonderful to hear your perspective on this and all the insights that you've been able to share. While we wait for additional questions, I can ask one more question that I know has been part of the online platform thing that we use in part of our discussions, which is that we know that disadvantage and marginalization is very multifaceted. And we understand that oftentimes food insecurity is also paired with other poverty and other forms of disadvantage, for instance, lack of access to quality education or to healthcare and to support and quality information that might improve health and other types of outcomes. So we know that a lot of disadvantages tend to kind of co-occur. And so one question that, I know we're all keeping in the back of our minds, but would be good to kind of share with the public and see what folks think is, how do we also think about solutions in a more holistic manner, right? Rather than just saying, okay, here's this one thing that we're trying to fix. How do we take into account the fact that any disadvantage or marginalization that we see here is likely coupled with other forms of disadvantage? And until we've solved each of these, we can only go so far by just tackling just one specific thing. So I'll leave this question to really anyone who wants to jump in, but I will use my moderator rights to maybe call on someone if no one is speaking.
Yeah, Juan here, Radiet, thank you for that. Maybe I will jump in here. And the first thing to say is that the beauty of looking to this through systems lens is at the end, of course, that is highlighting the notion that everything is connected. But then when we drill down to specific solutions, it's true that sometimes it's kind of hard to see, because they can be very focused. So how the other pieces are coming together. Something that I think it's super important for ourselves to always remind ourselves is that, we are talking about, the same woman, the same farmer, the same indigenous person who is at the same time, cultivating the land and also accessing health services and also getting education for their kids. So it's one individual. It's only us who are making this kind of categories and splitting into different sectors and subsectors. But at the end of the day, it's the very single person. And the other thing is that whatever we invest to emphasize one another element, we may be disinvesting in other aspects, right? So when we say that X% of funding should be to something, that may mean that, other sector could get less funding. So I think it's really very pertinent that we look into the holistic nature of food systems and keeping an eye on all these, connections with all the other elements. Said that, we have here in the summit 5 different action tracks. The focus today is on one of them. That we will not be able to deliver all these, all these ideas or game changers that we are putting forward unless we look into them in light of the other track changes. They have to be systemic. So we are midway in the process towards convergence across the different track changes. So now some of these solutions may look a little bit isolated, but of course the intention is that as we move forward, each of the game changers will speak to the game changers proposed by the action tracks. And at the end, we will find these meeting points where all these different needs that you are referring to, Radiet, can be tackled in a kind of harmonious manner. Over.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that framework that you mentioned, Juan. I appreciate that. Anyone else want to join on this answer?
May I?
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. So I really, that's right. That we really need to get a systemic and holistic approach and to really transform the food system to have more resilient food system and more sustainable. We cannot change one dimension on one aspect of the food system. We have to change all the system and to achieve the SDG. So in the working group action track 4, with many participants talk about agroecology. Agroecology is a way to really address sustainable farming system And agroecology is a pathway for changing food system, a pathway which is really well suited for small farmers because it takes into account the territory, takes into account the biodiversity, the diversified activities of farmers, livestock, fishers. So it's quite important to support agroecology. And for that, and maybe we talk of, if we want to talk about solution, game-changing solution, we need to provide services relevant for agroecology. And one talk about access to funding, for example, but we also talk about learning and knowledge sharing based on agroecological practices well suited for farmers and developed, co-designed by farmers and local communities, indigenous communities. And but we also need to change or to adapt the markets, and in this case to have some certification to protect the products from the product under agroecological approaches like fair trade. We need local procurement to really sustain agroecological production and to provide healthy and nutritious food to, for example, for schools or for canteens and so on. So we also need to support short supply chain to facilitate access to markets for small farmers with agroecological products. So yes, we really need a holistic approach. We need to change many things to be sure to have more resilient and sustainable farming system, more adapted to small farmers and local communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Anyone else want to join? We can also move on to some of the other questions that we have, but would love
I'd
to.
like to make a comment if I could.
Yes, please go ahead, Peter.
Okay, one of the things when we're talking about agroecology is we want to support it, but we need more research and policies on it, because when you look at the examples of agroecology, they tend to relate to smaller scale production. And what we actually need is actually looking at also larger scale production, more intensive agriculture, and saying, how can that be made more agroecological? How can it be changed? Because we've got a whole audience there to convince of the need to make changes, but we need the research. When you look at agroecological research, it's talking about lower inputs, which is good, lower use of pesticides, fertilizers. So a lot of this research is not going to get done by the private sector. So government funding and state level funding will become very important. This is an issue we need to flag up in the discussion effort in the Food System Summit. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate that additional perspective as well. I think I saw Frank about to speak. Frank, if you were going to share something, we'd love to hear from you. But if not, apologies for putting you on the spot.
No, thank you very much. I raised that later on because I'm supposed to speak. I was just going to make an answer to the question you raised about a holistic view. To my mind, the important issue is the values that drives the, if you want to enhance the role of women and gender, it is changing the value of the system that we have at the moment. And in the same way, when we look at our relationship to the landscape that we have, it's the value we have of the land. But maybe I can speak about that because it has been covered late by someone earlier. But so I think the summit needs to also look at these intangible aspects like values to be important game changes in what we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing more from you later. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So one thing that is almost certainly on everyone's mind, effectively, day in and day out, is the impact of this pandemic and the sort of the damage that it's done on all of the different systems that we had in place, including our food systems. And we know that this has had different types of impact on different communities. There have been communities that have been sort of shut out of food sources. One example that comes to mind is my home country of Ethiopia, where there's entire sort of ethnic groups that have been really struggling as a result of the pandemic and other things that were going on as well, but also the pandemic. And with the start of the vaccinations being delivered in some parts of the world, that gives us some hope, but we are all kind of painfully aware of the fact that this is going to take some time. It's going to be a long road to recovery. And while we're doing that, we still need to think about the damage that's been done on the systems that we had previously put in place. At the same time, I think we also see it as an opportunity to sort of reimagine certain systems. So I wanted to hear from really anyone here. I think everyone here has interesting perspectives on how you think through the impact of this pandemic on our food systems, and how you think about what opportunities there are to design and redesign these systems so they can be even more resilient and equitable for people and their livelihoods as we look ahead.
Yeah, maybe I could jump again, but I'm sure others will like to say something. I always think on this impact of the pandemic in food systems as three consecutive waves of crisis, right? The first one was once the crisis started in the global north, meaning in Europe, in the US, the impact that had in the economies in the global south and the markets there. So the decline of remittances and how that affected the income of the poor in rural areas in the global south. Or basically, the end of tourism, and that was very key in many countries in the global south, even in rural areas like in Latin America, in Thailand, etc. Also the decline in the price or the decline in the demand of global commodities that many countries in the global south are relying on, etc. Then the second wave was in fact how the lockdowns and other restrictions that many countries in the global south have been imposing to control the pandemic have been also affecting farmers in so many ways, whether that was the access to the inputs or the access to the services, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, it's just the long duration of this process and how this is affecting the global economy in all senses, right? And at the end of the day, what we observe is that it's basically the poor and the poor in the global south who are mainly affected, including in rural areas. So we do see, and we are extremely worried to see, a real danger of food insecurity growing and even hunger in many geographies in the world, right? In terms of how this could be a switch in the conversation and the way we understand food systems, I would only focus on one piece, which is, this has been a sort of a shake for all of us, for many of us, in the sense that we have to reconsider how important short value chains are, proximity, right? Connecting farmers directly to the markets, etc. Globalization is extremely important, but in terms of shock, it's those value chains which are shorter tend to be more resilient. And I think this is a big lesson that COVID and the impact of the pandemic it's having, not only in the countries in the global south, also in the countries in the global north. But again, I'm sure that others will go on to elaborate on some of the other new ways of thinking on food systems that the pandemic is kind of forcing us to consider.
Could I make a comment?
Yes, please, Peter, jump in. Yes.
Yeah, the COVID has hit the poor in the food system, and that means poor farmers, and that means poor wage workers, whether they're migrants, whether they're women, whether they're casual, temporary, or what. And it's going to force some radical rethinking of the food systems, because what we have to recognize has been a process of concentration in food systems, whether it's on the crop side, whether it's on the livestock, poultry side. We've got large units, we've got large factories. Some of the meat factories employ 7,000 workers. So how are we actually going to restructure our food systems, our factories? How are we going to shorten the food chain so that we do have more sustainable systems? It's really thrown it's shown the cracks in the food system in a strong way. But we have to recognize there's been a huge process of corporate concentration. Absolutely huge, in all aspects. Are we going to continue with that sort of type of corporate concentration, or are there alternatives? Because this is really what it's thrown up. We've also got to recognize that within that, you need to strengthen rights. One of the things that's happened, one of the positive things that COVID has caused, has been in Germany, the right that meat factories now have to directly employ the workers they use. They can't go through subcontracting. They simply cannot do it. It's illegal now. And that's a very positive thing, because that means those workers, in terms of their working conditions and also the living conditions, will get better standards. And that means we get safer food. There's also another aspect of COVID we have to remember, because when you get COVID infections, it just doesn't affect the farmers, the workers, it affects the surrounding community. Because the COVID infection, has lots of implications. So we have, on a farm, factory and community level to really actually rethink food systems. We can't have the same corporate concentration models that we've had in the past. It's not going to be possible.
Thank you, Peter. Is anyone else?
Can I jump in?
Oh, yeah, please go ahead. Omar, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. No, I just to follow up on what Peter was saying about the opportunities that also COVID brought here. And I just wanted to mention the importance of social protection and how COVID has highlighted the high vulnerability and poverty of a lot of participants of the food system, and how governments actually understood that and with different partners managed to sort of rapidly extend the coverage of social protection to many rural population specifically, but also to urban population that have difficulties to have an access to food. So I think that it was also an opportunity to make people more visible and the importance of social protection more concrete for government, and especially within the food systems. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Omar. I see also we have one person who would like to speak, I'm guessing. Is that correct? Yes.
May I read it?
Yes, please go ahead. Would you mind saying your name? I couldn't
this
see
is
it.
Shantanu Mathur from IFAD.
Okay.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to link your second question to what you'd asked earlier, the importance of holistic approaches, the importance of a more multi-stakeholder, multifaceted, multi-sectoral approach, and not multidisciplinary, but I would say an interdisciplinary approach. And I think COVID-19, the response to it by the international development community actually gives us an opportunity to build back better, as a lot of people have been talking about. It is important to be pluralistic. There are lots of trade-offs involved, so we can't just, take on a single silver bullet approach to it. No cookie cutter approaches. What IFAD does, for instance, is to look at a more holistic approach, looking at socioeconomic issues, looking at the biophysical aspects, and very much a context-specific type of solution involving communities in a participatory rural development manner. So very much an inclusive rural transformation approach, where we would be able to bring in the whole paraphernalia from inclusive rural finance, looking at policy reforms, looking at institutional reforms, and of course, technology. And here we are not just talking about knowledge coming in from the formal sciences. I am looking forward to listening to Frank Roy later on. It's about blending informal science with formal science, building, for instance, on indigenous knowledge systems, for instance, in the context of that are able to address those trade-offs between agroecological degradation, and also address climate change, the hotter, drier, more variable climate conditions that we are going to be facing. So looking at holistic approaches, but in a very context-specific way, looking at socioeconomic, but also biophysical, circumstances of communities together. So I'll come back later. Cheers.
And we'll look forward to it. Thank you for that. Florence, would you like to share something?
Yes, thank you very much. I completely agree, of course, with Shantanu, but I would like to build up on what Omar and Peter have said before. If you look at what happened with COVID, at the beginning, in particular in the first wave, it was cities which from one day to the other had to do something, in particular to ensure access to food to the most vulnerable people in the cities. Many of those cities had never really thought about that. And they had to link with civil society in order to really start overnight on this. So there's a lot of experience on how to assist vulnerable population groups in access to food from this experience. The other thing that's extremely important is the importance of urban-rural linkages. We all know of seasonal migration from rural area to urban areas. We all know that urban food consumption is influencing the way people are now eating in rural areas. The separation we have between rural and urban is very much done by us in the institutions. And I think it's very important we move to have a more local development, territorial development, where the role of cities, and in particular small and intermediary cities, is going to help the most vulnerable people in urban areas and in rural areas. So I think it's an important dimension. Don't forget cities, that's where most of the population lives now and eats now.
I hadn't thought about that. That's something to think about. Even just more broadly, what are some divisions beyond the urban-rural one that we had seen as fixed that we might be rethinking as a result of this crisis that we're living through? That's a really interesting perspective. Okay, Christine is jumping in. I'm guessing, is this the end of our discussion?
No, we're getting so many questions, so I want to keep rolling. Okay. I just want to make sure they're all coming back to you. That's my responsibility. So first, I think it's important for everybody to know who's speaking and who's not speaking today. So the people who are watching on Facebook Live, you should know that the Action Track 4 leadership team is built of human rights experts, small scale food producers, fisher folk, who are all behind the scenes, and they're the ones shaping our work. It's not CARE, it's not Michelle. Of course we contribute, but if this is really to be a people summit, that is who is actually shaping our work. There should be a link that was just posted on the Facebook Live page for you to see more on our online platform of who is behind the scenes at all time. And some really good questions came up. So Magdalena mentioned the extremely important role of the Committee on World Food Security, and especially right now with the voluntary guidelines on food systems for nutrition. Everybody on this call has been actively involved in the Committee on World Food Security process for decades now, and that's why we're involved in the Food System Summit process. We have the CFS chair who's helping us out, the HLPE as part of our leadership team to make sure that that evidence, that negotiated text, all the guidance that has come from the Committee on World Food Security is put front and center in this space as well. As you rightly say, a lot of this isn't new solutions, but it's giving them new light and finding countries to commit and really implement some of the solutions that have come out of the Committee on World Food Security. There was an excellent question from Shaliza, which I'm going to invite our colleague Bibi to respond to. It was about technology and innovation from e-enterprises to new production techniques are a great way to accelerate livelihoods and inclusion. We need to ensure action tracks are linking to them, but how do we do that? And there was one more that I'm going to throw in from Omar. Coming over to you, Omar. The question was about how can we get our farmers, the basic unit of the food systems, to ensure safety nets like life and health insurance, pension credits, so that they are cushioned in time of shock and pandemic. So let's start first with Bibi and then maybe over to Omar on those two questions. Thank you.
Oh, hi.
Thanks, Chris.
Sorry, Omar, go ahead.
No, I didn't get it because, sorry, Bibi, go ahead.
That's fine. No, I think I just wanted to point out that throughout this entire spectrum, technology and innovation from e-enterprises all the way to new production technologies, for example, these are new ways and great ways to accelerate livelihoods and inclusion for everyone, for smallholders all across the spectrum, family farmers. So we need to include in part of the discussion, how are we going to ensure that the action tracks link to innovation and technology for each action track, for nutrition, for sustainable consumption, and all of them, So I think that's an important part of this conversation that I wanted to raise. And I think that it's good for us to look into this and to discuss this further. Thanks.
So can I go ahead now? Understood? Okay, so for the question related to the access to social protection for farmers, I'll try to be very brief, but basically farmers are generally working in the informal sector. So that's why they generally are excluded from labor's regulation and have a limited access to social protection. So how we do this, generally the system that we have in terms of social security are not adapted to rural areas, and especially not to the agriculture sector. So generally what we do is we try to analyze a bit what are the different barriers of a better access to social protection in this sector. So basically looking at the legal barriers, the financial barriers. We can consider also the geographical barriers when farmers are really, say, living in marginalized areas, and so we try to basically improve the access to social benefits by adapting the system according to the livelihood in the farmer sector. One thing that I can add also is also the importance of advocacy at the government level for making sure that let's say regulation can be changed. And generally for that, we also try to understand a bit more the socioeconomic characteristics of those farmers, understanding a bit more their risk, and so also show their specific vulnerabilities to the government as well. And last thing is also to improve the, let's say, information around the rights to social protection to those farmers, because most of the time in the large cases, those farmers do not have the information and do not understand their rights to have an access to social protection. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Could I just add one thing on this to what Omar said, yeah?
Yes, please go ahead, Peter.
Basically, when we're dealing with agriculture, the official figures is that less than 20% of farmers and agricultural workers, it's not just farmers, it's agricultural workers, have any form of social protection. And when we talk about social protection, we're talking about things like basic health insurance, basic unemployment benefit, maternity protection. We're talking of things like workers' compensation. We're talking about basic rights. The ILO actually recognizes nine basic social protection rights which are lacking. So I think we just need to look at it in terms of farmers and workers, and that includes food processing workers, agricultural workers. It links to fishers. So it covers the whole spectrum. It's not just farmers. We've got to get used to looking at the broader food chain, at the people who actually produce our food. It's a wider spectrum, and they all suffer lack of social protection. So thank you.
Can I say something on top of what Peter said, because it reminded me of something?
Yes, please go ahead. And I think he also wanted to speak right after, so we'll go ahead with that.
Yeah, I didn't mention the importance of social assistance intervention, because my intervention was very focused on the social security, so contributory schemes. And I think it's also important to, let's say, so most in many cases, social assistance programs are not universal or are quite targeted, and do exclude a large part of the rural population when the targeting mechanism are not, let's say, adapted to the livelihood of those populations. So it's also important to focus on this. And to add on top of that is, I think it's also important because a lot of people are, and we call them the missing middle, a lot of people are not poor enough to have an access to those social assistant intervention and let's say not do not have enough income to contribute to social security schemes. So there's a large part of the rural population, and in this we can talk about the farmers, but also the workers in agriculture, but also going beyond even the production aspect of the food system. A large part of the population are not covered at all, and it needs to we need to have a sort of a progressive approach where we promote the economic inclusion of the poorest to also improve to improve their possibility to contribute to social security schemes as well. So that's all for me. Thanks.
Thank you. So, yeah, it's not on social safety net, social security. It's about the innovation, digital innovation. To come back to the question addressed to Bibi, we have digital innovation. It's a huge challenge for small farmers and local communities. There are a lot of investment from research and from the private sector to invest in this field and to provide new tools, new services based on digital solutions. You have new, very well-suited services to link farmers to markets, quite useful with very interesting experiences. But mainly the digital solution is used to provide advice to farmers. And in this case, the big data, the data collected in the field from research or from farmers, from communities, are used by some organization to provide dedicated advice. And what we really need for small farmers and local community is a designing of specific services based on exchange of knowledge, sharing of experiences, local experiences, and not only provide advice from one organization to farmers, like a top-down and transfer of knowledge system. So in this case, it's a huge challenge to try to reorient some investment to be sure that some digital solutions are well suited for small farmers and are also based on local knowledge, based on indigenous knowledge, not just based on knowledge managed by research or other organization. And for many people, for many observers, it's a huge challenge to be sure that the next revolution based on data is also something useful for small farmers and local communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are at time, so we'll move on to the next segment, which is the solution sourcing. This will be our opportunity to showcase to you a few of the solutions that we've received through consultations with stakeholders. So we'll show you that. But I just want to thank everyone who participated in this discussion via chat or by speaking here for touching on so many important topics on holistic solutions, on intersectionality, on different ways of knowing, on COVID challenges and post-COVID solutions and everything. So I appreciate all the very insightful perspectives you all have shared and the sharp questions that have been asked. I appreciate that. So we'll move to the solution sourcing segment of our event today. I'm not sure exactly who's going to start. Maybe Christine, you can tell us which solution we'll be starting with.
Yeah, happy to hop in. I know Frank wanted to present one of his solutions, and Rima was also going to join with one specifically on gender throughout the food systems, but she just mentioned she had to drop off. Sorry, everybody. We had expected a few more people to join, but like all of us these days, we're pulled in a million different directions. So maybe we start with Frank.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Frank Roy. I'm an Indigenous person from Northeast India. One of the things that we have discussed was why we need to pay special attention to Indigenous peoples and why they are an important game changer for the Food Summit. As we discussed just now, COVID-19 is a very important experience we have had, but it has taught us one very simple but undeniable lesson, and that is to sustain our future livelihoods and well-being, we must hereafter maintain our harmony and our balance with nature. As Indigenous communities, we very much understand, acknowledge, and have been traditionally, as Martin said, been walking the talk in this practice. In some of the villages in part of Northeast India, when a woman becomes pregnant, she would immediately start thinking of a particular tune which would become the name of the newborn. After the birth of the child, the adults in the family and the community would constantly hum that tune so that the child could gradually identify with it. The lullaby has no words, but is influenced by the natural sound around them, the humming of bees, the birds, the sound of wind, water, fire, earth. This is considered to be the mother's personal way of connecting to her future generations with nature and to inculcate a sacred relationship with it. Indigenous food systems, as Carl has explained just now, are underpinned by this traditional value of a sacred and a caring relationship with nature. And I think from there comes the consequent values of consensus building, of gender equity, and sharing of collective knowledge, values which we desperately need to develop a more caring and equitable world. Indigenous food system with these values can bring a transformation to our food systems and therefore play a very important part and build the resilience against biodiversity loss, climate change impacts, and even environmental degradation. So we sincerely hope that there will be an acknowledgement by the food systems, perhaps for the first time in the UN, that the indigenous food system is a game changer because, as Carl has summarized earlier, it connects previously disconnected indigenous change makers. It promotes biodiversity as a benefit not just to themselves, but to the society and the world at large. It'll strengthen the agency roles of indigenous youth through intercultural training and specialist services. It'll empower indigenous organizations to enhance the promotion of technical innovations, which you speak out, but technical innovations that are based on their local resources, on their local traditions, and their local skills. And it will facilitate the emergence of young indigenous researchers, mentors, leaders, and innovators. Shantanu Mathur of IFAD spoke about an interdisciplinary approach. We are here speaking of a slightly higher ground, and that is of an intercultural, acknowledging that indigenous knowledge is one knowledge system, contemporary science is the other knowledge system, and we bring an intercultural knowledge so that together we can build a perfect world. So therefore, we suggested that to be able to do all this, we create a global indigenous food system trust fund with an Indigenous Peoples Board of Directors to be established with a capital of around 100 million to strengthen the agency of Indigenous youth, especially women, and create livelihood opportunities to revitalize nutrition-sensitive local food system, to develop local value chains, to document, to recognize, and research on the best practices in technology, governance, and traditional knowledge, and to support fellowship programs which will build young people to be bridge builders towards a more caring and equitable approach to farming, livelihoods, and the environment. That was the package that we had discussed as one of the game changers or golden nuggets, which will be presented to the other groups. Thank you.
Ready it? I was just going to add that we finally had Shakuntala join. Thanks so much for that, Frank. Shakuntala, did you want to go next?
Thank you, Christine. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, Christine. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm calling in from Penang. Can you hear me? Christine?
Yeah, we hear you perfectly.
Yes, we hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have been on from the beginning, but just could only hear and see, but not participate. So I just closed down and started all over again. Christine has asked me to say a few words about this action track and talk about people for the people. For the people and by the people. So I want to make some comments on that. So with respect to Action Track 4 and within the whole UN Food System Summit, all 5 action tracks, I am particularly happy to be engaged with Action Track 4 because it is so people-centered and relates links to all other tracks, but especially people-centered. And if I would give some examples of when I think about people who are engaged in the food systems and who we should particularly be thinking about in terms of advancing equitable livelihoods. And I'll give some examples from the area in which I work. I would talk about young boys and young men who work on boats, on fishing boats. I would talk about women in sub-Saharan Africa, along the Great Lakes of Africa, and the many hundreds of thousands of women who work in the processing, in the drying and smoking of fish. And I would also, from where I'm sitting right now in lockdown in Penang, think about the very many informal food eateries and markets where there are so many men, women, and youth engaged in these forms of this part of the food systems, and then their livelihoods and the livelihoods of their families depend on their work, which has all dried up now with COVID. Christine asked me to bring in the conversation about people, for the people and by the people. And one of the first things I want to talk about, I want to draw the attention to, when we talk about people and when we talk about livelihoods, we must remember, if we look at the rural populations engaged in food systems, it's some of those who, for example, employ workers for one season, they are also employed by others for another season. So a very important aspect of livelihoods with respect to rural populations, even also with respect to some urban populations and the poor, seasonality is an extremely important issue that we must deal with. And I think sometimes when we talk about scaling and having big solutions and taking into consideration large population groups, we tend to miss the nuances that are important to take into consideration if you want to have solutions that work for the populations. So context specific, population specific are important, and in some cases, perhaps more important than large scale with respect to solutions. The other point I want to make is that, again, context specific. So if you would look at people working in food systems and you look at different parts of the world, if you look from where I work sometimes, for example, in the Nordic, it's very different because there you have access and you have the rights to be parts of organizations and parts of associations. So you do not stand alone. You stand with a group of peoples in your quest for an equitable livelihood. It's extremely different when you stand alone or if you have the opportunities to stand together. And to be together in relation to others who are together, because many times when you stand alone, then you stand against a group. But if you are a group, working with another group and engaging with another group, having to get solutions with another group, then it's very different. And as we know, numbers mean a lot if you would stand together. And there are some solutions which, when I look at the rural poor, many of who I work with in rural settings in sub-Saharan Africa, it's very difficult to find solutions if you do not take into consideration the basic rights of people, if you do not take into consideration the role of governments and the role of legislation and laws. So there is a role of, yes, of peoples, but people who have this, have sit in positions that give them the opportunities to talk on behalf of others. And then when you would talk on behalf of others, then you must also have the ability to listen to the voice of others before you talk. I'll stop there for now. Christine, thank you.
Thank you so much, Akuntula. It's great to have you here and to hear from you as always. Up next, I will actually switch hats from facilitator to member of this Action Track leadership team, which I've been serving alongside everyone else that you've heard from today. And in particular, we don't have our youth leader, Maiti Newman, who's been doing an incredible job making sure that all the solutions and problems that we're discussing are also keeping in mind the needs and desires and constraints of young people today. So Maiti Newman is not here, so I'm going to maybe speak as a youth adjacent person. I'm not quite a youth anymore, but I'm happy to just kind of represent that and just make sure that that you all know we are thinking critically also about what is important to youth today. We know that digital and other forms of transformations are changing a lot of things about how we engage with one another, how we learn, what challenges we encounter, what goals we may have, and how we communicate with one another to bring about the kinds of changes that we would like to see. So it's important that we keep this in mind as, you know, this is kind of the consideration of kind of having multifaceted solutions, right? It's important that we keep in mind that certain segments of the population, and especially youth, may have different ways that they would like to engage with solutions and different problems that weigh heavier on them than the other populations that we might be looking at. And it's especially important to consider intersectionality here, and this was mentioned earlier by a few of our speakers. We know that the lives of youth of one gender versus another may be very different. Youth living in certain rural versus urban populations may be different. We know that the needs of Indigenous youth are very unique to that community, and this is something that we must take into consideration. And so we just wanted to share that these are concerns that we are keeping in mind and thinking about critically. But as always, we're very happy to hear from you all, from the public, about what we might be missing and what we might not be addressing adequately. So please do feel free to drop your questions or chat or thoughts in the chat, and we would be happy to engage in that way. And we hope that we can also keep the conversation going past this public forum in many different formats, either public forum or fora or online on the platform that we mentioned earlier. So I wanted to mention that, and now I'm going to put back my facilitator hat on and open the floor to another question. So we have a question from Ruchi Tripathi coming to Carl now that Rima has had to drop off. And the question goes, how do we ensure that women's work is recognized within our framing solidarity actions and not just external capital? How do we change the incentives in the food system in this direction? So that's to you, Carl.
Thanks, Rediat. And I think part of that question is actually I've seen tagged with another question from Ruchi along the same lines, which is about capital and access to capital and the stress on financial inclusion. And this is a really important issue and a really important question, because from what we know, women's empowerment is known to be achieved through at least three universally proven methods. One is childcare, another is access to reproductive health rights and services, and a fourth is access to savings. Now, access to savings doesn't necessarily mean access to credit, but of course, if you have access to savings and increase the capacity to save, that implies that you then have increased access to credit. And I think that's an important possible solution that we can and should think about. I think it's not simply a case of increasing access by small-scale producers or women in food systems to formal banking. But if we're able to stimulate the scaling out of informal savings groups and micro savings and microcredit schemes, then that does lead to both increased social capital and financial capital, and the ability of women to save together increases their aggregate capacity to borrow together and to enter into business together and to drive the better terms of trade and bargaining power. So I think there are ways to increase access to finance that are perhaps not innovative, but are not necessarily based on traditional forms of access to credit, although producers and businesses do need formal access to credit also. Very briefly, and another one, if I may, Redia, take the question from Stephen Thornhill, which is also really interesting and important, and I think if I may very briefly address that around payments for ecosystem services, or at least remuneration for ecosystem services by women and other small-scale food producers or communities that are dependent and custodians on natural resources and biodiversity. Again, a great question and a very important one. I think there are ways and means of doing that, sustainability funds and eco-credit funds, but also communities often appreciate and value non-monetary returns and non-monetary benefits. So I think if policies and interventions can increase or improve the provision of services to these communities, then we know that they are as custodians of natural resources and biodiversity, that's what they do. And if we're able to support in other ways, then that will underpin that capacity. So I'll just leave it there. Back to you, Rediat.
Thank you so much. That's very insightful. Is there anyone else who'd like to jump in on what was just shared? If not, we have a couple other questions that we'd also like to cover, so we can move on from those. Okay, so the next question I want to share is from Dwight, and this is to you, Frank. Dwight says, in my opinion, Indigenous communities can be divided easily because of corporate profit-driven approaches. They can even bypass free prior informed consents with money. In this scenario, how should we support the Indigenous community? I can repeat the question if you'd like me to do that. Do we still have Frank?
Yeah, can you hear
very
me?
good. Okay. Yes, I can hear you now.
I think, oops, sorry. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yes.
You can hear me. Okay, sorry. I think the important aspect is first and foremost to help Indigenous people know that you acknowledge their systems because of the historical marginalization that has taken place and the colonization of their minds and their systems. Very often Indigenous people themselves tend to look down on what they have. That's why I said earlier, building on the values of what they have and their sacredness of their relationship to the land and to each other is something that we need to constantly remind them. Once we have done that, then I think one of the basic principles by which we can help Indigenous people is to recognize self-determination. And this is also enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think that's another aspect. And in many of the systems, it's for us also who may be outsiders, but who are helping Indigenous people to follow the free, prior, and informed consent. I think if these three or four aspects are done, I'm sure that the corporate sector will not be able, but on their own, Indigenous peoples may not be able to fight everything. They also need partners. They also need friends. That is why meetings of this nature are very important. And that's why we always speak of an intercultural and a multicultural approach, so that together we will fight not because only of Indigenous peoples, but because of the values which underpin their whole cosmology and their lifestyle and what they offer to the world at large. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. That's very helpful to hear your thoughts on this. Shakuntula, would you like to jump in to share further?
Oh, really, I wanted to get in after you, may I? Because I wanted to add to some of the comments you made on youth. Can I do that now?
Oh yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Yes.
Also, since Human wasn't here, and there were issues that she and I had talked about. So there were 3 points she asked me to raise. So in Food Systems Summit and with a lot of this global work that we are doing now, we are looking towards the Sustainable Development Goals and to 2030. But in the work we do with youth, it would be better if we have a much longer term perspective. And youth are going to get older, they're going to get to be younger youth coming up, and you have this you have this transformation taking place within that sector. And some of the points that she asked me to use, also following up to follow up on Frank, was one, that there is a lot of focus on the use of digital platforms and in the use of new digital innovations with respect to the placement of youth within this action track. And how do we use these new platforms not just to create new knowledge or to create new ideas and new solutions, but to look towards what we already have. For example, Indigenous knowledge, which is not yet in a way that can feed into a digital platform, because they are, for example, in storytelling. It's not in data that you can add. So how can you merge and link these new solutions of digital platform with respect to youth and local knowledge, indigenous knowledge? That was the first point. The second point was how do you use what youth what they have learned and what they have gained through this process, so that they can pass it on to the younger youth who are coming after them. And thirdly, in a more formal way, can we find solutions where we can pass on knowledge from youth through systems like the schooling system, for example. I'll stop there. So these were some of the points that Yukum and I talked about with respect to youth within the Action Track 4. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Florence, would you like to close this off, the discussion section? Would you like to close
actually, yeah, thank you very much, Juliette. Actually, I wanted to go one step back because we started talking about funding. And I think that's a really major issue. We have for many years talked of microcredit until we realized sometimes it meant putting people in further debt. And the whole issue of microfinance remains very important. But also we need to review the existing funding mechanism. A lot of people, of farmers, have been obliged to change towards much more industrial farming processes in order to get money. And we're not able, we are facing the consequences now of Europe, that these models are not sustainable and they have to move out of agriculture. So we need to revisit the present funding mechanism in order we do not generate involuntarily destitution. The whole issue of ethical banking, I think there are things from there that we may learn from. And I'm thinking in particular in agroecology, we're going to need a different kind of funding support. So we need to adapt, revisit the tools we have with the view of that broader approach to food systems, and in our particular group's case, to inclusiveness, not to leave anybody behind. The other dimension that has been emerging in last years and which is very relevant to food system is all the social and solidarity economy. And I think again there, it's a different crowd of people that are working to create jobs for people, but they're very often in the food sector. So how do we, I think the challenge in the Food Systems Summit is indeed going to bring the convergence between different groups of people that have been working on similar topics and get out of our comfort zone to get something that will actually enrich all of us.
Thank you so much, Florence. So we're running out of time for today. So I'm gonna hand the mic back to our leader, our action track leader, Michelle Nunn, who'll close us off. But I just want to say again, we covered quite a bit of ground, but there's so much more ground to cover. So we really hope that we can keep the conversation going with you all. So please feel free to reach out, continue to engage with our lines of thinking and our solutions that we're proposing, and ask us any questions and give us any feedback that comes to mind. So please, let's keep the conversation going. And with that, I'll hand the mic to Michelle Nunn, who'll close us off. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Radid. That was a beautiful job of a difficult moderating job for several hours and lots of complexity and questions and dozen plus reflections and commentary. And Shakuntala, it's wonderful to, we are partners in this as vice chair and as co-chair, and for each one of you who's you've heard from today, again, volunteering their time, expertise, wisdom, and deep experience in this work. And we're really lucky to have them. And we're really lucky to have you all participating today and to helping us refine the work that we want to carry forward. I think, it would be impossible to summarize the totality of this conversation, but what I heard over and over again was sort of people-centered solutions and rights-based approaches, and getting at issues of the power imbalance, and also really finding the equilibrium, harmony, and sacredness of sustainable food systems, as Frank's well articulated and beautifully articulated. So you all have had a chance to kind of hear an initial collection of the game-changing categories that have been shared and that we've tried to bundle together in order to create a focus. You've heard about the issue of how can we go deeper around strengthening agency, which I think we can all acknowledge is so important. And you've heard a chance to get a little bit deeper on some of the promising solutions, some of the game-changing solutions that Juan and Carl and Frank brought forward. And again, I think a recognition that these are not about new things that have never been considered. These are often going back to things that have been known for long periods of time, but that we need to now integrate into more holistic ways of going forward. So some of the things that I was really taken by, I would just say, to hear Seema talk about the very practical way that women, for instance, 45,000 women now have the opportunity in the supply chain, women-owned and managed supply chains, how important that is. We heard about the importance of the urban and rural linkages. And we certainly heard again about some of the challenges, but also the imperative of both social assistance and protections, especially for those who are so often unprotected within food systems. We talked about innovation, but also how it has to be grounded in local and context and proximate knowledge. And we talked a lot about Indigenous knowledge and how we build upon that. I would just reinforce that I think that those of us who are participants in, and especially those of us who are leading this action track, really feel like our work is around facilitating and curating a set of solutions that emerge. And I hope that those solutions are both a framework for equitable livelihoods in the food systems, and also that they are a set of policy recommendations that get taken up by member states, and also that they're emergent solutions that create ownership and action and traction and actual results. And that's where I think you all come in. I hope Martin started the conversation with us by pointing to a few of the things that you can do to continue to be involved. I would just reinforce those: become a food systems hero, advocate for within your own constituencies, including with your own government, host your own dialogues, and also register for continued participation within this broader food system summit community. This is very much at the end will be a success based upon whether we truly do bring your solutions to the table, your ideas. So thank you. And a special thanks again to the extraordinary, the folks that you've heard from today. I hope that we can continue to really be grateful for their leadership and call upon them for that leadership. And as I said, I know that we all think of our work as a framework for collecting the very best ideas that exist and putting them into action. So thank you all very much for participating, and we have our work cut out for us, but also a really important moment. Maybe I'll ask Shakantula if she has any other closing thoughts to join me.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm extremely happy that we have opened up to these discussions, and we have invited so many different groups to come and join with us, and they have accepted the invitation and are with us. And it's just very enriching and would really help us not only to look at solutions, but also look across the 5 action tracks as how we work together, so we come up with some comprehensive solutions that cut across the whole food systems. Thank you.
Excellent. So I hope that you all will be energized to continue to bring to life some of the exciting ideas that you've heard today, from the Indigenous Peoples Trust Fund to new ways of engaging young people, to new engagement strategies for women's own supply chain, to governmental support systems and assistance and safety nets. And Rediet, thank you again for being such a brilliant moderator. And I'll leave it to you if you have any last thoughts that you want to close us out.
No, that was a wonderful note to end on. Thank you again, everyone. Thanks for sharing your time, and we'll see you very soon.